is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs at Village Preservation. I already recognize a number of you, but how many of you are members of Village Preservation?
Oh, yes.
Good, good. You are my favorite people. The rest of you, shame on you. I hope after this evening you will be convinced to become a member. Village Preservation has been around since 1980. And we're dedicated to preserving the history and the culture of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've helped get landmark designation for over 1,250 buildings. And the reason I always ask about membership is because that helps support these programs. It helps keep them free and open to the public. So I really do ask, please take a moment, go to our website, villagepreservation.org. Check out the work that we do, the advocacy work, the different programs we have going on. And we also have a number of resources available as well. If you want to put together your own walking tour of the history of the neighborhood, go there, check out our resources, and you can put your own women's history, Black history, LGBT history walking tour together for yourself. We have an image archive, lots of awesome stuff. But thank you so much for coming out this evening. There's no air conditioner, so I feel like it's historically accurate. We know what Whitman felt like there. It probably was even worse in Pfaff, I'm imagining, being underground. But we have a very special guest, Karen Karbiener. She's an internationally recognized Whitman scholar and teaches at New York University. She's published widely and curated several exhibitions on the poet, including an illustrated edition of Live Oak with Moss, Poet of the Body, New York's Walt Whitman. She's a native New Yorker and a local public scholar, and she's the president of the Walt Whitman Initiative, which is a co-sponsor of the event this evening, which is a nonprofit organization serving as an organizing center for cultural activism and poetry-related events. Karen, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and again, it's a little hot in here, so I want everyone to be comfortable. Just making sure that everyone can see the screen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because I am not mic'd, so maybe we should actually use the mic. See if it works. I can always try and talk louder, but let's see. Hello.
It's another reason we need your support, so we can buy some updated equipment.
I think this will work. Can you hear me better now? Is it better? Great. Okay.
Closer to your voice.
Okay, let's see. Raising it up like this. Doesn't want to stay up.
Equipment may not allow it.
Yeah. Oh,
Join
no.
today.
Oh, no, I don't want to. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, manually. How's that?
Yes.
Great, okay. So there is no question too small. We are going to start from scratch on this idea of Pfaff's Cellar, which was a very, very special place in the 19th century, not just for Walt Whitman, but especially for him. And the pattern of this evening is that I'm going to give you this introduction with slides, and then we can discuss and ask questions. I have a few freebies for you. I have actually 2 folding exercises because as William mentioned, I am the president of the Walt Whitman Initiative. We just opened, as I've told some of you, a poetry library, which is just beautiful on 91 South Street, free to use for everyone, staffed by volunteers, 700 plus volumes of donated poetry. And in a historic 18th century building, we're partnered with Fulton Stall Market. Some of you may know Bob Lewis, who started the Green Market idea in New York, and he runs a small Manhattan farmers co-op at 91 South Street, and they basically gave us the space for the library upstairs. So we're very happy, and we have students staffing it. And my student in there now, Belaji, who's amazing, came up with these beautiful folding exercises, and she wanted you to have them. So I have all sorts of fun stuff to give you before we go and actually walk to Pfaff's. So the idea is we're a little bit far away, right? It's going to take us maybe 10, 15 minutes to get there. But if you are game, I'm going to walk down to this very building depicted here, and I'm going to take you inside and downstairs to the cellar so you can absorb the poetry of place. It's still intact. It's a circa 1855 twin tenement building that is not landmarked, not protected in any way. And the reason that I contacted GV, SHP, and William was to give this talk to kind of bring it to light again, right? Remind us we have yet another amazing building that is unprotected, that deserves our attention, and at least a plaque, right? Maybe even in the ground, since it was a cellar bar. So you're looking at my first slide, and I'm indebted to the artist Nick Buffin for this fabulous image of the site where Pfaff Cellar once was. Do some of you recognize Hans Deli from near the corner of Bleecker and Broadway? A 24-hour deli there. They're nice enough to let us actually go inside and see the cellar. They're really wonderful people, so I like to patronize them when I can. And the way that Nick lets us know that this is the site of Pfaff's, since there is no sign, is if you look on the cab door, it says Charles Pfaff's Broadway restaurant, the vault at Pfaff's, right? That's your symbol right there. So yeah, it's of course sit back, relax, have a fun evening, but really also remember that this is a really amazing space with lots of history that does deserve our attention. I'm going to start, of course, with Walt. So you're looking at probably the most famous image of 19th century American poet, that is Walt Whitman, as depicted by two remarkable artists. Gabriel Harrison, who was an actor as well as a daguerreotype artist, took this photo. There's a legend about it. They were both Brooklynites. Walt's walking down Fulton Street in Brooklyn, and Gabriel Harrison, who had a penchant for drama, came down. He said, old man, come upstairs, I must photograph you." And the daguerreotype that resulted from that has been lost. But luckily, as you probably know, you could not reproduce photographs yet in the 1850s in books. So Whitman quickly had that photograph, now lost, converted to a steel engraving by another great artist with a penchant for drama, who is Samuel Hollier. So this is Walt twice removed, right? And it is a legendary image. He is now, of course, our earliest LGBT icon. He is America's poet, and this image really helped him attain that status. And I want you to just look at it for a second because it's highly unusual. Do you all know what a frontispiece is? You know, facing the title page in 19th century books, you often had an image of the author. And often it was the author's head and shoulders. Why? It's the seed of learning. Why do you need to see the body of a poet? Whitman changes that all over the place, right? He puts in his entire, well, almost his entire body. This was probably a 3/4 plate daguerreotype, so maybe not room for the knee down. But very nicely, Hollier has shaded around his legs as if to suggest he's emanating from the page, right? So he's got this sort of three-dimensional, real presence that was highly unusual at the time. And also unusual, where is the cravat? Where is the fitted jacket? Why is his hat on? Why is he looking at you, right? You're supposed to have that yearbook, askance look, you know, not focusing on anything. And instead you have a very provocative image here of a good-looking man who's very confident about his body. The pelvis is forward, right? He's got a hand jammed into his pocket. The other one is on his hips. Sort of a cocky pose, right? A self-assured, almost sensual feeling pose. And if you look at his unbuttoned Oxford shirt, he's got his undershirt peeking out. Horror of horrors, right? He's not only underdressed and wearing a hat, he's actually showing you his underclothes. So it was a very radical image. The book did not sell, right? Whitman tells us he printed 795 copies. By the way, he had to self-publish because no publisher wanted to publish those 12 poems in 1855. So his friends, the Rome brothers in Brooklyn Heights, volunteered to print it only if he helped set type. And guess what? He had printer's apprentice training, very lucky, and from that day on, all of his books have his hand in them. So one of the reasons that I love Whitman, besides just the poetry, is he was a DIY artist. He really thought about the book, the material book, in addition to what was actually in the book. And even all of these features, right? The images, the filigree, everything is considered. He was really trying to invent American poetry. So I present him to you here, raw in 1855. He's 36 years old. This is his first book of poetry. And now, I'm going to take you to 1860. It's a lot of change, right? So 5 years later, Whitman is looking quite different. You can still recognize him. He's gotten older, right? He's just turned 40. His shirt's still unbuttoned, by the way. He's got a Byronic tie on, right? Like one of these Bohemian looking ties. And he's wearing, as he called it, his roundabout coat, which was bucking the system, the trend at the time, which was to have tighter fitting men's clothing. Walt liked it oversized, what we would call now a really bohemian look, right? And if you look close enough, I don't know if anyone lives down in Flatbush, but if you do, the Brooklyn College down there has this hanging up in special collections. It is an absolute pleasure to look at it closely because his chest hair is emanating from his shirt. I mean, who does that, right? So he looks a little bit more distinguished and he's put on a little weight, but he's still got it, right? He's still showing some skin there. And often remarked too is the redness of his cheeks, especially contrasting with the whiteness of his forehead. Like, how does that happen, right? He's getting sun here, but not here. So could be his hat again, the troublemaker, right? The brim sitting low on the forehead and the sun peeking in underneath it. But some people think that that red is alcohol.
Yeah.
Right? Because in 1860, Walt has already been hanging out for quite a while at this place called Pfaff's Cellar. And it is a new bar, right? It opened up around 1858. And what is different about Pfaff's, and I'm saying it the German way, right? It's P-F-A-F-F. So some people say Pfaff or Pfaff. But Charles Pfaff was from Switzerland and kind of like educated in the whole beer cellar, beer garden idea. And he came to New York with a new recipe for lager beer. New Yorkers in the 1850s, this was something really new for them because we were still drinking stouts and ales, right? Sort of a British inheritance. And now come over all of these Germanic people with this new frothy lager. Well, guess who loved it? You can see it on him actually. And maybe again that redness showing up there. So let me go into some of the changes. Sorry, this thing is a little glitchy. Some of the changes that happened to Whitman from 1855 to 1860. So as I said, 1855 he comes out with Leaves of Grass, flops, right? The best thing he does is he writes to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's the Don of American letters, right? Basically shoves the book in his face and, you know, really is waiting for a review. And what he gets from Emerson is a letter that is really congratulatory. He says, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career." Can you imagine being a young Brooklyn writer and getting a letter like that from someone like Emerson? Whitman carried it in his pocket for years. So that was a really good thing that happened. But not a lot of other good things happened with that book in 1855. So the price went down from $2, $2.50, to to $1. He just like couldn't shake the copy. Now you couldn't find a first edition for less than $200,000, right? There's maybe 200 of them in the world. They're considered the cradle of American poetry, the most valuable book that you could buy in American literature. But starting where he did, he had a really rough time. So he persisted anyway. And in 1856, he came out with a second edition of Leaves of Grass. That one contained a poem called Sundown Poem that became Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which for a lot of people is their favorite Whitman poem, right? A classic American ode. That book doesn't sell either. So he kind of goes on hiatus. 56 is an election year. 57, 58, 59, he kind of drops out of the picture. He's working a little bit in real estate with his family. He was a carpenter, also a trained carpenter from his father. And he hears about this place that opens in New York called Pfaff's Cellar. Now, Whitman was not a joiner. He wasn't a club person. But something about Pfaff's attracted him, so that he says every night from 1858 to when he left for the Civil War front, December 1862, so almost over 4 years, he was going every night to this bar, about 6 miles round trip from his house in Brooklyn. One of the reasons might be on the screen behind me here. So Whitman kept notebooks all of his life. He came from a big dysfunctional family. They did not have money. He did not have a mentor. He had to drop out of school at age 11 to help support his family. And paper was always in short supply. So he would actually make his own notebooks. It's one of the reasons I get my students to learn how to bind books, because he did this himself. And you can see some of them at the Berg collection here at New York Public Library, Library of Congress, Huntington Library in California. It is very moving to hold them, full of love. And especially these. I know it's probably hard for you all to see this, but in 1857 and 8, he was keeping notebook after notebook with lists of men's names and features. So just because I knew you probably couldn't see them, I put some on the screen. On the left-hand page on the top, there's like a bracket and it says 4th Avenue. Arthur, big round sandy hair course, open. Petey, round head and face. Wallace, sailor boy, English, was in Japan. That's all up there. And then just on the right, a few lines. Tom Riley, handsome Irish fighter. John Kiernan, loafer, pretty good looking. Why was Whitman keeping these books? It's very hard to tell. But the lists are very interesting, right? Once you get past this idea that these are his little black books, literally, right? He's cruising, he's in New York, he's kind of discovering himself, and he's really looking around and actually bothering to write down everybody's name, a little bit of info on them, sometimes their age. Occasionally it says something like slept with him, which, by the way, I would take lightly, because sleeping with somebody in the 19th century, a lot of people did this, right? Boarding houses were piled up bodies after bodies, so it didn't necessarily mean sex, but some level of intimacy was there, right? And obviously from these lists, do y'all know about phrenology? The head bump science, the pseudoscience. So Walt bought into this, unfortunately, like so many other people did, had his bumps read by Fowler of Fowler and Wells in 1849, included his phrenological chart in the 1856 Leaves of Grass, so you could see everything about him. But when I look at these lists, and often that he remarks on the size of their head or the shape of it, I think that's the influence of phrenology, right? He's sort of doing an amateur reading of some of these young men that he's attracted to. So I show you this to kind of set the stage about what's catching his interest, and then show you a little bit of New York. So in New York, in the 1850s, there were a lot of daguerreotype galleries, right? People were crazy about photography. Whitman, most of all. Portraiture was really in. Whitman is the most photographed 19th century American poet. He just went up and down Broadway to Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner and had his image made whenever he could afford it. Now, this guy, Victor Prevost, came from Paris in the 1850s, and he fell in love with New York the way that Whitman did. And instead of doing portraits, he bucked the system. Prevost took images of New York. So for me, he's really important. And actually, Brian and I included collages using these images in Live Oak with Moths, the book that's kind of about the poems that I believe Whitman wrote down at Pfaff Cellar. But something about these capture the spirit of Whitman's New York, especially the idea of kind of like a mysterious, cruisy New York. If you look at them, I think the first thing that stands out is there are no people, right? It's like really quiet New York. But Prevost had a long exposure. So anybody who was walking by wouldn't be caught by the camera. So it's not that New York was empty. It was just the exposure time, right? That prevented people from being actually photographed in these images. Occasionally you see like a blurry horse or something telling you, oh yeah, there were bodies there. But it's part of the reason that I think that these help me see the way that Whitman was waking up to New York. Now remember, he's a Brooklyn boy. He's born on Long Island, right? You can still go visit the Whitman birthplace in Huntington. When he's 4 years old, he moves to Brooklyn, and that's really where he grows up and he lives most of the time. He loves Brooklyn. But in those late 1850s, he started really thinking about going into the city more. I think to see men, to kind of really realize like what he desired. And this was the New York that he saw, exactly the right time. This is also really interesting. Prevost didn't always take the shot that you would think, right? Like a really touristy shot. He shot like from backs of windows and things, like the real life, right? The quieter life. I have a few more of these. And Prevost also shot a few daguerreotype galleries. I'm not quite sure why, but that's Gurney's. That was a really famous daguerreotype gallery at Leonard and Broadway. I don't know if that building still stands. I think it might. Do you know? I'm not sure. It looks familiar. And if you look down on the edges of the photo, you do see that blurry horse, right? And maybe it's kind of a sort of a sense of blurriness. There must have been people moving when he took that shot.
Is Leonard and Broadway financial?
No, a little bit further above that.
Okay.
Yeah, like Soho.
Okay.
On the right, you see Brian Selznick envisioning, he's sort of trying to enter Whitman's mind about what New York was like for this kind of newly out poet, a poet who is really discovering his preferences and his love and his body. And I really love the way that Brian has played with, you see that window that actually looks like somebody is standing at it, the regular shot. And then Brian took that and he interjected 19th century images of men in there as if to sort of show us what was going through Whitman's mind, right, while he's walking around in New York. And that's another Prevost that interested me because that's a Hiram Powers sculpture. So maybe these look familiar. The Met has some of these. When the Crystal Palace opened here in New York in 1853, we were copying London's Crystal Palace, and we put in there all the latest inventions and greatest art. So a lot of the American sculptors of the time took a lot of attention. People loved sculpture. And I put that Fisher Boy image there because it reminds me so much of Whitman's poems. I really wonder, because probably this went on display in the Crystal Palace around 1853. Harrison takes that photograph of Whitman in 1854. Did they know about that sculpture? The pose has kind of that grace to it, right? So just, I don't know, a for instance here of influence. Oops. And here we are on Broadway. in 1861, and Whitman could well have been one of the many figures here. I know the shot is a little bit fuzzy. I'm actually really grateful to have it. The only place I've ever seen this photo is Luther Harris's fabulous book that maybe some of you know. And we're looking up Broadway. So I don't know if you can see it, but that's Grace Church all the way in the distance, the steeple. And the first building on the left is where Pfaff's was. So that was the hotel, sorry, the Coleman House Hotel, that was above, and Pfaff's was in the cellar of the Coleman House Hotel. The story goes that Pfaff bought this place. It was really the theater district at the time. So a lot of actors and actresses and journalists would frequent it. A very stuffy space. You had to kind of descend from street level, right? There was a little sign saying Pfaff's Restoration, sort of like a French word, Restauration. So almost like a secret code place, but people knew what to do, right? They knew to go there. Let me show you a contemporary picture. This was actually taken yesterday by me. So they've given it a paint job. It's not looking too bad, right, for a 1850s twin tenement. I love that the shop next door says Lusty. I think Walt is just laughing somewhere about that. But this building still stands, right? A relic of a far gone New York City past, just right there near the corner of Bleecker and Broadway. But once upon a time, that basement wasn't just for chopping broccoli and storing bottles of water. It was actually a really active Bohemian enclave. So here you have two images. They're wood engravings done by Frank Ballou, who is an artist of some note. And it's kind of like a good Pfaff's, bad Pfaff's scenario, right? Or you could say before booze and after booze, what actually happened with them. And on the left, I'm not sure if anyone looks familiar to you, but at the head of the table is Henry Clapp. So one of the reasons we started thinking about having a Bohemia at all, a Bohemian society in New York, was that Clapp, who was a journalist and kind of a reformer at the time, he went to Paris in the 1840s, and he was just in love with the left bank. The artists, the freedom, you know, the beautiful cafes, people just talking about what they did, the openness. And when he came back to New York, he was determined to find a place where this kind of community could flourish. And he wound up picking this Cellar bar right in the heart of New York's theater district, just for accessibility, but also I think because Charles Pfaff was very tolerant. You know, he allowed cross-dressing, he allowed women in there, women with children could come in, and as you all probably know, New York restaurant culture was incredibly sexist, right? Men could eat out, women for the most part could not do that, and much less bring children anywhere. So this was a really permissive space. I think that's Fitzjames O'Brien, the journalist, just next to Henry Clapp. And if you keep moving to the right, that little guy, to me looks a little like Edgar Allan Poe. And you might know that Poe is sort of like the god of Bohemia, right? For the French, and I think for us too. Poe died in 1849, so he would not have been part of this, but Ballou might be evoking Poe's spirit here, right? Just by including him, sort of the, you know, the alcoholic Poe, the dark Poe, the raven Poe is here. So noticeably no women on the left. What happens when women and beer, lager, come into the picture? Mayhem, right? Conversation is at a halt, right? They're just like partying it up. Henry Clapp looks especially terrible. He's like completely out of it. But most of them have become focused on something else. So it's kind of mocking Pfaff's, but it's also showing that Pfaff's was becoming something, right? Like people thought this was actually pretty cool. There was like a group of people who were very tightly bonded and had a great time, right? Even if it was decadent. So a few examples for you about how this idea of Pfaffs grew. There were ads everywhere. There were ads in other newspapers about going to Pfaffs, as you can see on the left. Go to Pfaffs. And I think Henry Clapp is probably responsible for a lot of these because they're quite creative, even in terms of, layout and design. You will find the best viands, the best lager beer, the best coffee and tea, the best wines and liquors, the best Havana cigars. In here, the best of everything at moderate prices. Sounds pretty good, right? They've got a good mix here. So ads were proliferating for Pfaffs, but the clientele remained pretty tight. There were two different segments of the bar. You'll see it when we go. The area, maybe I'll just go back to that other image for a second. So you see the vaulting. The space underneath sidewalks, the cellar space, was often illegal to use, right? Because they would collapse, right? And then what would happen with the weight of people walking on the sidewalks? But of course, most shop owners dug below the sidewalk in an effort to get a bit more real estate. The vaulting of the space next to Hans has collapsed. I went down there a few years ago and I saw that is completely gone, right? Like everything's caved in. For some reason on the Hans side, the side that we will go see, the vaulting has persisted. So even though it was an illegally carved out space, they managed to make it work. Now that space, okay, I'll hold off on that. That space is in contrast to the space that's kind of like further back into the building, which was more of an everyman's hangout. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is there was a front round table where you just saw everybody hanging out, sort of like the well-known journalists, the actors, but behind the scenes and next to the bar, everybody just hung out, right? Cab drivers, you name it, workers, and that's where Whitman always chose to sit. He was never up at the round table with the others. He was friendly with them, but he always chose to sit in the back. Probably because of his democratic nature, but also because I think he was really attracted to a lot of the working men back there. And indeed, he met really his first serious love interest at Pfaffs. But before we get to that, just wanted to show you that Pfaffs, another way that a cult of Pfaffs really developed is they had their own currency. And some of you have seen this, but I actually brought in the coin. So I'll just hand it around so everyone can see it. Pfaffs and some other really well-known restaurants and bars of the time would mint their own currency during the Civil War, partly because there was a currency shortage, right? We were making a lot of bullets instead of coins. But also this kind of created I must go to Pfaffs. I have a coin. I must, use my money. And they had it looked quite nice, right? Like the top is a script note, as they're called, with some imagery. Actually looks like it's European in a way. And they pop up occasionally on eBay. That's where I got that one. And here's a massive blow up of the coin that you are looking at, with a monk here, of course a symbol, he's probably carrying some beer or wine to somebody. And it does indeed have the shortcut for Charles, right? Charles Pfaff, Broadway, New York, 647, and restaurant in the middle. So yeah, just like a place that held together in
Can I
many.
ask something about that? How would somebody earn that currency with Pfaff? Pay somebody for a service with that money?
That's such a good question, and I'm not sure myself, but I would think that maybe they started giving change or something with this.
I've had that experience, like when there have been coin shortages in Europe, that you would get something else back as your change, whether it was some kind of note or candies, but something else
Right.
than the money that they would be able to give you back.
Thank you. So maybe that, or maybe people bought into it somehow, but somehow it proliferated enough that you could look on eBay every now and then and find one, which I urge you to do. It's kind of fun to own a little piece of history like that. There is a really amazing menu collector named Henry Voigt. So when I did my last exhibition in 2019 at the Grolier Club, Henry is a Grolier member, and he said, "Hey, I have a menu from Pfaff's." I was like, yes. So I blew it up for you here. And this is a little bit after Whitman uses Pfaff's. So the story with Whitman is he's at Pfaff's from 1858 to December 1862, because then he leaves to go down to the Civil War front. The Civil War started April 1861. He could feel it, right? Some of the wounded and the sick were being brought up to New York. He was already volunteering in hospitals up here, but he got news that his brother was wounded in December 1862, took off for the war and never came back. In fact, another reason to really respect him is that he got a job as a clerk, like an everyday clerkship at the Department of Indian Affairs. And at night, he would use his money to go into the hospital tents, distribute last requests, write letters for soldiers to their parents or to their loved ones. So it was really an amazing service, just incredible generosity that you see. So he wouldn't have seen necessarily this exact menu, but as I note here, one of his favorite things, beefsteak. Yeah, he's not exactly, he wrote a manual, by the way, Manly Health and Training. Did you all hear about this? It was discovered recently, and it's kind of like a keto diet. It's like, eat a lot of meat, right? Like, eat raw vegetables. So, not too bad, but Pfaff's was definitely a good choice for his diet. Oh, and very cool to look at the menu, actually, because and you are invited to look more closely at the slides later, or I can send them to you, but it's written in English and German. So I think the assumption there is that there was a larger clientele that was German speaking, or else it was just Pfaff kind of flexing his muscles that way. But a really varied, interesting menu, lots of stews and roasts. Oh, and this is fun. So Pfaff's, of course, disappears eventually. Pfaff passes away. Everything fizzles out. A lot of the people frequenting Pfaff's wind up going to the Civil War. So around 1866 or so, Pfaff's really disappears. But in 2011, my friends, a team decided to reopen something like Pfaff's, a little fancier, if you ask me, just one door down, closer to the corner of Bleecker and Broadway from where Pfaff's originally was. And I have here, oh, thank you so much, which I would rather not pass around, but I do invite you to look at it later. They developed a menu that actually looks a lot like the Saturday Press, which was the Bohemian newspaper of the time that Henry Clapp edited. So they're actually really fun to look at. And Whitman is heavily featured in them. I put up this cocktails one because there's actually a Leaves of Grass cocktail. I don't know if I'm going to be able to read it. And I did try it when I was, did any of you New Yorkers go to this when it was open? You did? Did you try anything there?
It was a long time ago.
Right. And it closed very quickly. They couldn't keep it going, which is so sad because it was such a fun experiment, right? Trying to bring something back from the past. And, it had this sort of speakeasy vibe to it. Just fun to see the menu change, but I don't think it was a year until they closed. Now the regular Pfaffs, just a little bit more about them. These are some of the people that frequented it. We've already talked a lot about Henry Clapp, up there on the upper left. William Dean Howells, a very well-known writer, also very interested in Pfaffs. My two favorites, Ada Clare and Ada Isaacs Menken, two very controversial young actors. Ada Menken is most famous for wearing a flesh-tone bodysuit on a live horse on stage and actually getting seriously hurt. And Ada Clare often brought her illegitimate child to Pfaff's with her and was very outspoken, a huge defender of Whitman's. Fitzjames O'Brien, another journalist that was in the picture, but there were many, many people, and if you're really interested, there's an excellent website out of Lehigh University. My colleague Ed Whitley edits The Vault at Pfaff's, and you can look up individual names and see photos. It's actually really, really amazing. So as far as people who frequented Pfaff's that were kind of closer to Whitman, I have presented you here with something that's at the Bryn Mawr College Library. Bryn Mawr got a lot of Whitman items because one of the custodians of his estate had a Bryn Mawr connection. And I just happened to go to Bryn Mawr, so I learned about these hidden Whitman items. This is a real treasure because that young man who is depicted in both of those photos is Fred Gray, and if I had to, as a 19th century scholar, point to the first gay men's club in America, I would say it was the Fred Gray Association, a loose association of young men hanging out at the back tables at Pfaff's. Whitman loved sitting with them. They were all 20 years his junior. He loved that. Just hanging out with the young boys, and this was the namesake of that club. So one of the young men, unfortunately, who passed away in the Civil War, but represented to Whitman a certain type of freedom and joy and community that he had never experienced before. And I mentioned before his first really important love interest. So sometime, probably 1858, Whitman met an omnibus driver named Fred Vaughan. And Fred was Whitman's favorite type, of Irish descent, about 20 years younger than him, black hair, blue eyes, the whole thing. It's exactly almost the way that Pete Doyle looked. Pete was really Whitman's love of his life that he met later. So we don't have any images of Fred. We do know that Fred frequented Pfaff's with Whitman. He actually lived with Whitman in Brooklyn, in the family home with the mother and all of the other children. But this letter, which is to me a really tragic ending to their relationship, when I did the Whitman exhibition at the Grolier Club, we had this letter, which I consider just like an important letter in LGBT history. Just a wake-up call, really, for Whitman with this first love of his. So here is the transcription. It's Fred writing on his company stationery, right? Remember, he's an omnibus driver. Walt, I am to be married tomorrow. Saturday at 3 o'clock at 213 West 43rd Street near 8th Avenue. I shall have no show. I have invited no company. I want you to be there. Do not fail, please, as I am very anxious you should come. Truly yours, Fred, New York, May 2nd, 1862. We never hear about Fred and Whitman after that. I don't think Whitman went to the wedding, but just imagine receiving a letter like that, right, without any warning. So just showing you that Whitman's life was really not all joy.
Did he keep everything, or did he keep things that were special?
This is such a good question. He wanted everything destroyed at the end of his life, but his executors for his will kept a lot of it. It was a complete mess. So really the reason that we have this, right, is that somebody thought it was and Walt hung on to it, obviously, too. So he was a bit of a pack rat, but it was really disorganized and a lot of stuff has gone the byway, but this is a treasure, right, that somehow has survived. Was there someone else with a comment? Sorry.
No, I was just asking you to repeat the question, but it was
Oh,
obvious the question.
yeah, sorry. Yeah, please ask away. I'm really happy to answer. So, famous Pfaffians that were at Pfaff's. How about Walt Whitman? I love the New York Illustrated News cover here. Whitman was front page news. Why? No reason, folks, except he's really cute, I think. Looking very good and kind of like in a whole bunch of other stories about disasters like shipwrecks and stuff. There's a big picture of beautiful Walt Whitman on the cover of the New York Illustrated News. So Whitman became kind of, I wouldn't say a household word, but sort of like a weird, edgy character. You know, he's like hanging out at Pfaff's, coming into New York quite a bit. Even this sketch here, which is from Harper's, I know that's really tiny writing, so I've written it on the side. Gifted by nature, this subject, with a head that's swollen, with literary talent, is allowed to go to grass with all the fire and fancy of a Byron, etc. So a little bit mocking, right? But a kind of a sign that Whitman is sort of in there, right? People are paying attention. He's interesting. And here's some more of that. Really interesting image on the left, right? I call it a predatory Whitman. It was from Vanity Fair, and there was actually a poem beneath it called Song of the Counter Jumper. So the counter jumper is a really interesting code word in the mid-19th century in New York for an effeminate gay man. Somebody who kind of reaches too far over the counter to help you. And the poem is hilarious and really mean to Whitman. And you can see some of that in that image, right? Where Whitman seems to be trapping one of these young counter jumpers with his really famous hat. And how do we know that that's Whitman? Well, if you look on the right, that sketch was actually in one of his notebooks, not drawn by him. Same hat, right? Really tall, and with a nose notably shaded. So that's why I call that the inebriated Whitman. Looks like maybe one of these young men he's hanging out with at Pfaff's got hold of his notebook, sketched, there was more than just this one sketch, right? And it drew him in there, and maybe he had a reputation, right, for, I don't know, being attracted to younger men. That's the sort of general tenor of this. Okay, so this is Pfaff's today. It is not glamorous, friends. When we go down there, right, it's literally kind of like a working space now. But if you squint and if you believe in the poetry of place, you can feel the power of this space, right? The space where Whitman felt free, right? And as I tell my students, it's a liminal space. It's in between stuff. It's not on street level. You can sense street level, right? There were like little glass places where you could look out and get a feeling for the sidewalk. But you're definitely in this retreating, comfortable space. And I think he could really flourish as a poet and as a person in this safe space. I think all of us know about this, right? Having a space that allows you to express yourself changes everything. And that's what Pfaff's was to him. That's why it's so important that it survives, right? Because I'm sure Whitman wasn't the only one to kind of get so much energy. So I love to bring students down there, or anybody. And this is my crew from last summer, actually, the Whitmaniacs, as they like to call themselves. And this is another sketch here by Nick Buffin. That's actually Nick, the artist, wearing his Leaves of Grass t-shirt. And that's supposed to be me. With my famous black, my leather bag I carry everywhere. And that's Pablo Javier, who used to be the Poet Laureate of Queens, checking out the space. And that's Walt down there, of course, right? Because there's always Whitman impersonators that come along for all of this. There are dozens of them in New York. They show up for all the readings, very fun. So just a few things. I see what time it is, so we're going to wind down around 7. But I did want to show you, it's not just that personally Whitman got a lot from Pfaff's. Also as a poet, he was really inspired by this space. And what I have back here, it's too long to go over and it's rough, it's just a draft. But he felt so good in this space that he actually just like wrote this crazy celebratory poem. right? Laugh on, laughers, drink on, drinkers, bandy the jest. So feeling his oats, right, in a place that he feels accepted. And again, not a finished poem. But a little better is something like Calamus 29. And by the way, that's a famous image. I think, William, we used that for this event. But it was done far later than Pfaff's. And now that you've learned a little bit about Pfaff's, I bet you know too that Pfaff's really didn't look that fancy. This is kind of making Pfaff's look much more sophisticated. That's supposedly a young William Dean Howells that's shaking his hand. And this is just one poem that might well have been written about the space of Pfaff's. One flitting glimpse, caught through an interstice, of a crowd of workmen and drivers in a barroom around the stove late of a winter night, and I unremarked, seated in a corner. Of a youth who loves me and whom I love, silently approaching and seating himself near, that he may hold me by the hand, a long while, amid the noises of coming and going, of drinking and oath and smutty jest. There we two, content, happy in being together, speaking little, perhaps not a word. It's actually touching, right? Because with Whitman, you often expect sort of like a really sort of celebratory, almost bombastic style. But these Calamus poems and the Live Oak with poems that preceded them show us a more intimate portrait of Whitman, right? Maybe the Pfaffian side.